Welcome back to our fifth episode of Mindset Monday. I'm here with my fabulous co-host, Dr. Rohit Chandra, a child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist from MGH Chelsea Healthcare Center. Today is all about women and leadership, two words that belong together. How can girls and women empower one another and improve their mindsets or establish sets of attitudes and beliefs about their roles as leaders and change makers in our world? Who better to speak about this topic than our guest speaker, Dr. Susan Duffy? It's my true honor and privilege to introduce you all to her. Dr. Susan Duffy is the Executive Director of the Babson College Center for Women's Entrepreneurial Leadership, a co-founder of the Women Innovating Now WinLab Venture Accelerator, and an inspired educator and advocate for inclusive innovation as a driver of social and economic growth. Throughout her career, Dr. Duffy has recreated what is possible for the organizations she leads across diverse sectors, including pharma, professional services, robotics, and education. Dr. Duffy earned her PhD from the George Washington University, is a member of the prestigious Wilford White Fellows of the International Council for Small Business, and received the 2019 Practitioner of the Year Award from the United States Association for Small Business and Entrepreneurship. Dr. Duffy is a member of the National Women's Business Council, sits on the board of the Tory Burch Foundation, and serves on the expert advisory group of the Bioscience Investor Inclusion Group. Welcome. It's an honor to have you on this podcast.
Oh, thank you so much, Sachi. I am delighted to be here with you.
Awesome. So let's get started. My first question for you is that I know an important goal of yours through all the amazing work you do is developing and optimizing human potential and human experience. So what gets in the way for women?
Well, I think what gets in the way for women gets in the way for all humans. And the first thing that women can do is put our situation and potential implicit and explicit bias into context. So if we understand that bias is actually an evolutionary function, right? That over time it's become part of our survival system. And according to a large body of research, implicit bias, that bias that's underneath our consciousness, it doesn't align with what people really think their values are, or who they think they are, how they consciously define. What it does tell us is that we get messages from all of the places around us, the way we're raised, our socialization, where we live, and our brain makes connections for us. And those connections get cemented over time. And that is where that evolutionary adaptation comes in. That's useful for us. We don't want to have to think about every little experience that we have. We want to be on automatic pilot. The unfortunate part is some of that automatic pilot makes connections that then get stubborn. We see messages of women associated with kitchens and fashion and kind of what we would say is stereotypical feminine activities. And we immediately think, woman, she belongs in the kitchen. I hate to even say that frame out loud, but we see masculine or men associated with cars and airplanes and more, what we would call masculine associations, and we automatically associate those two. Breaking those associations, understanding that they're all around us, that men and women and everybody who identifies in between, we all have them as humans, is the first way that we can start to push against and then empower our own minds to help us be the optimized leaders that we have the potential to be.
Wow, what a great start already. I absolutely agree with that. I know you've been an entrepreneur for 10 years, and you also serve as the executive director for the Center of Women's Entrepreneurial Leadership at Babson College. So could you tell us what it means to be an entrepreneur?
Yes, so this is interesting. Many people will interpret the word entrepreneur very narrowly as a founder of a business. I like to think of it as a lifestyle, that being an entrepreneur or being an entrepreneurial leader means that you have the ability and the desire to kind of see what is the current state, imagine what could be, and then harness the resources and lead the way to get to that future state. So you are constantly functioning in a how can I create value, net positive gain, wherever I am, whether that's in my schoolwork, whether that's in my community, whether that's in my job, or in a business that I might start. So it's really thinking about how do I create social and economic impact with my potential as a human wherever I am.
And what are some important qualities of women entrepreneurs and leaders and some challenges that they might face?
Well, I mean, I think the first is to believe that you can be entrepreneurial and that you are entrepreneurial, and begin to collect evidence and not dismiss evidence. You know, there's something called attribution theory, right? That says this is why this happens. And what we know is that this is gendered, giving credit, right? So that from a very early age, when things go wrong, women tend to point inward. Oh, I should have studied harder. Oh, I should have worked harder. Oh, me. It's my fault. And when things go right, they point outward. I got lucky. It was just the right time. I was surrounded by the right people. And the opposite happens for men. When things go right, they point inward. I'm a rock star. Aren't I great? I'm the right guy for the job. And when they go right, they point inward. And when they go wrong, they point outward. Oh my God, you didn't give me the resources I needed. This isn't the right time, that we should have tried to do this, etc. So I think the first thing that women need to do is when they hear positive affirmations about themselves, or they get good news data, they need to take it in and breathe it in. Right. So that's one way that you become an entrepreneur, is you begin to build confidence that you can do things and that you're fully capable of making the changes that you see that are needed around you. The other then is to kind of what I call house clean your head and get your own voice out of the way in terms of what we call kind of this theory around how do I start to mind read, right? Am I making predictions that aren't true? Do I have a crystal ball? And you actually get this film at 11, like this whole story that starts to go on in your head. And again, we have to get data that says, oh, no, that's not actually true. If you don't know it's true, if you don't have data for something, then it's probably either false or undetermined. We spend a lot of time churning around in the undetermined. So in summary, it's kind of like, believe you can do it when things go right. It's you that did it. And know that sometimes we get in our own way of saying, I think I should make a move in that direction. But then there's this little voice in your head saying, well, why you? Why should you do that? No, somebody else is better suited. And tell her to be quiet and get out of there and just take one step at a time forward. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about the methodology that I think is important for entrepreneurship, this one step at a time process. And we can do that now, or we can do that a little later.
So Dr. Duffy, so you run the Center for Women's Entrepreneurial Leadership at Babson College, like Sachi had correctly mentioned. And there is a research arm of it called Diana. Perhaps Diana may have preceded that. I read some fascinating research that said that that promotion versus prevention is what women need to think about, because when women are presenting to venture capitalists, the males who typically make up the panel end up asking questions around loss, around how they may lose money. But those same venture capitalists often will ask men questions around how they will earn money. So could you talk a bit about promotion versus prevention?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And it's interesting, Dr. Chandra, because this connects to that bias that we started the conversation with, that we don't really even know we're doing, right? And so what research has found, this is Donna Kantz and her colleagues, found that when women were pitching, both men and women venture capitalists, who are predominantly male, as you said, will tend to protect them and go into a preventative set of questions around how are they going to secure market share? How are they going to keep from losing what they may have gained so far? It's a very risk-oriented narrative. And women will catch that narrative, and when they go with it, they will spiral down to the worst-case scenario and be in a defensive posture, all about prevention of loss. And what we find is that VCs will do the exact opposite with males who are pitching. They will think about the possibilities, the opportunities, the potential for winning with men. And then when men catch that narrative and they go with it, it spirals upward. And so the trick is to catch the narrative where it lands on you, and to take control of it. So if it's tending to go downward, that you kind of spin it around and say, well, yes, we may have competition in that area, but let me talk to you about where we're beating the competition and our potential for market gains in this area. And you have to be alert to it. It's almost like we have to teach entrepreneurs to exercise this muscle. And of course, if they're spiraling in an upward direction, you probably want to go with it. And what the interesting part of this research was that the funding followed suit. So when the negative narrative was followed, very little funding was obtained, or relatively so. And when people learn to turn that conversation around in the moment, that funding gap dramatically decreased. So it's a really interesting kind of practical way to think about this is unconscious bias. These VCs are not sitting in there going, oh, that's a woman. I think I'm going to go with a prevention narrative, right? But we do it. And again, bringing it back to humans, we all do it, no matter what our identities are. We slightly privilege masculine and male, and slightly bias and negatively undermined women and feminine. There's another piece of research, if we're going to stick in the pitch room, from my colleague Lakshmi Balachandra at Babson, and she was just looking at how entrepreneurs showed up. And she found that when entrepreneurs show up in more of a masculine way, whether they identify as female or male, they will get more positive outcomes and more funding. So her advice to women is, kind of put on your masculine when you walk into that room, because it's going to serve you well. We do not find the same to be true in corporate research that we have. This is kind of the classic study. Catalyst did it years ago. Lean In has since done reporting on it. And that is where, if you are a woman leader, you face what's called the double bind. If you bring your kind of what we would call masculine end of the continuum characteristics to the table, you're decisive, you're rational, you're competitive, right? You will be considered effective, but you will not be liked. And if you bring your feminine side to the table, you will be liked, but not considered effective. Whereas men don't face that same double bind. They get to behave, and they're actually given a lot of credit when their feminine side shows up, right? So, but in the pitch room, Lakshmi found that it's very different. It's really worth trying to bring in your masculine self, because it plays well. And that's why we always like to start with this kind of bigger picture of human bias, right? Because it is everywhere around us, and most of us are not doing it on purpose. And many of us are working very hard to teach and kind of raise our own awareness. I call it honing your bias antenna on how is it playing out around me? How am I contributing to it and maybe not even knowing it? Once you start really looking for these gendered messages, you start to pick them up. You start to pick them up in commercials on TV. You start to pick them up in society. You certainly pick them up in your families and your communities, your schools, your workplaces. And it's just important to be able to see it, because once you can see it, then you can make decisions around if you want to try to disarm it, or you want to try to behave differently to optimize your situation. And that's another important message for women leaders. I don't have an answer to the double bind. And a lot of people are like, well, what are we going to do about it? I'm like, I wish I knew. And I think it's changing. But knowing it's happening around you gives you more opportunity to be able to say, in this case, I'm going to play along and I'm going to draw on this, and I might draw on my feminine side knowing that I might take a hit because I know it's the right thing to do and it's the most effective thing to do in this scenario. And in other cases, you might be like, whoa, 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 whoa. Do you realize what you just did? I know one woman who was in one of our programs had received feedback, and the feedback in her annual performance appraisal was that she was, quote unquote, abrasive. Now, this is coded language that we learn a lot about at the Center for Women's Entrepreneurial Leadership. The word abrasive, what does that mean? And she actually went back to her superior and said, what do you mean by that? What are the examples of that? Who else has this word in their performance appraisal? And the company did an audit of all performance appraisals and found that that language was only used in women's performance appraisals. And it was completely subjective. And to that person's credit, they took that language out and were much more specific about the constructive input they were trying to give that person. So, you know, it's a lifelong journey, and we're all actually relatively new at it. And it's exciting, though, because I think we're making significant progress, and everybody's going to win.
Yeah, but hearing your remarks, I mean, I'm saddened. I'm reminded of a friend of mine who was applying for a position at my hospital, and she said that a supervisor of hers at her hospital said that she was really quite aggressive. And she said, well, what I'm trying to do is make sure that I'm not being mistreated. You're working me a lot of hours, giving me a lot of new patients, and I want to be properly compensated. So I'm asking for proper compensation. We know that there's a gender wage gap and pay gap. And so she was branded as aggressive. And it was very frustrating to hear. And it's the same. Similarly, it's very saddening to hear that 50% of people in the world are born women, and yet women have to play this game. What you're almost describing is you have to learn to play this game because systems were created by men. And so you can't be yourself if you want proper funding. I mean, you're going to be underfunded if you simply are yourself. And so you have to learn, but who's going to teach you? And it sounds like, unfortunately, in order to learn, centers have to be created to teach women how to play this, what seems like a male-created game. And
and I would say that game is being played by anyone who is not the dominant in their environment, the dominant identity, right? Where these legacy systems come from. In workplaces, they typically are male and white, right? And that's what that was the way the structure and partnered if they have families with someone who has more full responsibility for children. So these systems of most of our workplaces were built up around those legacy systems. And we do know that anybody, right? So a person of color, a person that has other intersecting identities that make them not the normal, quote unquote, for that particular job, are subject to extensive bias. And just, it is heartbreaking to think that somebody is kind of painted as aggressive, quote unquote, and that definitely has a negative connotation in that setting. Whereas if someone with a different identity showed up and behaved that way, they might have felt that they were really standing up for themselves and good for them. And they might even change wage structures around it because look how great it was that he pointed out that to me. And it's changing. At least in Western cultures, it's changing, but not fast enough.
So I love how you're really, about human potential, and you're teaching women how to be successful in a world that is tilted against them. And you point out dominant, non-dominant, that there are other non-dominant groups that unfortunately have to learn how to, play the game that the dominant group has created. So that seems.
Yeah, well, so we all find ourselves in what we call in-groups and out-groups. So it's human nature to want to belong. Right. And to be around people like us. And so there's a couple of concepts that might be worth introducing at this point. One is this idea of in-groups and out-groups. And we're always part of both of them. In some places, we know that we're with our people and we're like them and we share characteristics with them, whether it's the schools we go to, the neighborhoods we live in, our families, whatever it might be. And we get them. we know that they think like us and they kind of act like us. What we unconsciously do is we then privilege our in-groups, right? We give them more resources. We give them more of the benefit of the doubt. We believe them. We support them. We encourage them. And the out-group, we don't, right? They're not quite like us. We don't understand them. And so we don't consciously bias against them, but we do. And to be in that out-group, right? To be that person on the outside saying, I'm behaving just like that person, only I'm being treated differently, hurts. It's not productive for any kind of human system. And it leads to real structural damage in an organization and any human system, whether it's a community, a school. You know, what the research tells us and why diversity is so important. A, it's the right thing to do, right? Social justice is just the right way we should treat each other. But B, it's the best way to be productive and get our highest performance. We have more variation of thought on the table. There is more, there are more solutions represented, more realities represented. We even find that in particularly diverse teams, the tension that can get created is really useful because it helps you get to a better solution, not only more options for the solution, but choosing the best solution if you have been taught how to respect difference. So you have these kind of agree to disagree or politely, you know, push against each other and better outcomes. So if you extrapolate that out to, I do a lot to mankind, and womankind. See, there's something, right? We don't even think of womankind.
Yeah.
Right? If we extrapolate that out, we're just better together as different types of humans.
Yeah.
And so it's an exciting time because I think we are finally paying attention to this. And the other piece besides in-group and out-group that we humans really have to watch for, and it's embedded in that concept, but it's called homophily. And that is, we like people like us, right? So we tend to choose them for our sports teams. We tend to choose them for the projects that we do. We tend to choose them, hire them, promote them because they look like us, they sound like us, and we trust them. And so we have to really be vigilant with ourselves and with each other and being able to point out, you know, I'm working with a lot of executives where they're trying not to create what we call a meritocracy. Keep hiring, and then they say, oh, we can't find diverse people. And like, yeah, you aren't trying hard enough, right? You really have to try hard and be intentional about diversity at a certain level. And this is where women leaders can really think about putting themselves out there to compete for positions that perhaps in the past were part of a meritocracy or did go to a dominant type. It is now more important than ever that we step up and say, give me a shot at this. And then I call this jump and the net will appear. This is another particularly gendered element. Women do tend to get it right first and then jump. Men are more likely to kind of just jump and go for it. There's an overconfidence bias that has been empirically validated on a gender, like looking through a gender lens. And so we need to be clear that men are going to jump. They have a go zone that's faster maybe than women's. It's not right necessarily. They're no more ready or competent at what they're going for, but they're willing to jump into it not knowing or not being secure around how effective they might be, whereas women tend to sit back, tick off every box. It's very rational, but you might lose out on opportunities. So I tell everyone, jump before you're ready. Know that the net will appear. You will be okay, and you have to exercise that muscle too. That's not something we're used to doing. It's kind of the prevention, in a way, the prevention narrative, and it is the way many women are socialized. Just sit still, be quiet, be a good girl, fit in, don't cause problems. And I'm not telling you to rip up the world everywhere you go, but maybe a little tear at a time is okay.
I love that you use the word socialization, because I think that's another thing that seems to be holding women back, that, and for that matter, any non-dominant group, any out group, they may internalize the in-group's beliefs about them. and they have to kind of unwrap that and overcome that, like hatching out of a, eggshell or something like that, or, you're wrapped up in a spider web and you first have to overcome that before you can learn to play the game and succeed. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about, what it's like to internalize, society's schemas and beliefs, and what you teach around that.
Well, I think we all do it. And one of the ways that we introduce this topic is we show this really interesting little video. It's relatively recent from the BBC. And it is, what they've done is they've taken babies, maybe 18 months old, and they've just switched their clothing, right? So they take a little boy baby and they put him in a little pink dress, and they take a little girl baby and put him in little overalls and a flannel shirt. And then they have kind of people off the street come in and play with them with all different kinds of toys. And the girl babies are given little fluffy animals and little dollies, and they're very gentle with them. And those they perceive to be boy babies, they sit them on tractors, they give them little spatial games to play, they give them trucks. So this starts before any of us are paying any attention to it. The people who did it were like, oh, I did that. Like, oh my gosh, I sure did, and so and then that turns into, what roles do children expect that are right for what they think are women and what they think are men? There's another cool video where these kids are drawing pictures of scientists and firemen, or a doctor, a fire person, and a pilot. And of course, they're all men for the most part in these drawings. And then the people helping them go out, change their clothes, and come back in, and they're all women, right? And the kids are like, oh my gosh, right? And we begin to internalize. And again, that kind of gets back to that first explanation around bias. These signals start to connect in our brains over time. These are the right jobs. This is the right behavior. This is the right clothing. This is the right affect for you as a quote unquote male or female. And I do want to say that I realize we're talking on the binary here. Yeah. And I'm very conscious that the binary is an outdated concept that we identify across a masculine and feminine continuum on many levels, whether that's identity expression or sexual orientation. But this we all are most effective as we draw on that full continuum of feminine, neutral, and masculine characteristics and behaviors. However, our research and still a lot of our challenges are anchored in those binaries, right? These are big groups of human difference. They are big groups of bias. And fascinatingly enough, the differences between women or between men are bigger than the net differences between men and women. So, but we've been socialized, to your point, Dr. Chandra, and we have internalized what we think and expect we are supposed to do, and suppose is in quotes, to do as a woman or a man, in quotes. So I think the way to push against that is to open up our eyes to this idea of we are most powerful when we access all elements of ourselves, when we call on that traditionally masculine element of ourselves, a true strength, and bring it to bear as the situation requires for that. When I think we've used examples as, when there's a fire, you don't want somebody to be collaborative and nurturing. You want somebody to say, get to that door now. That's an order, kind of a thing. There are times, and then there are other times, and we have lots of research that says the feminine side, in leadership particularly, is extraordinarily important. We want to nurture collaboration. We want to have people feel that they belong and are engaged. And those elements are really important when we're building trust, let's say, and in anything that is kind of more relationship oriented. So we think of it as task orientation and relationship orientation. And we need to do both. And so one way to start pushing against some of these social kind of constraints is to recognize it's happening to all of us, to start to experiment with places that are outside maybe our normal, right? So we all have our zone of normal, right, and start to just push against that a little bit, test things out. You don't have a whole lot to lose. You might think you do, but try it, and just begin to open yourself up to what the potential is. And the other thing that's really fascinating is you can go on the implicit association test website and take a test or two and get some actual data around your own bias, because that helps us understand too, we need to know what we're projecting on others as much as we need to know what we have internalized and are experiencing. And as we do this work over a lifetime, I think we're really going to change the world.
Yeah, the IAT is a brilliant test. Masarin Banerjee, I think Anthony Greenberg created it. It's fantastic. To go back to the word feminine, feminism is often kind of looked down upon, and I wanted to maybe Sachi to comment on that the word feminism has become very charged. So I wanted to have Sachi talk a bit about that.
Yeah, so I think something that I've noticed just, as a high school student or as a high school girl, if I'm in a lot of classes where it's mostly guys in my class, and I often feel like as a girl, there's already this kind of sense of like, the boys just seem to have this confidence, and they like to speak over the girls in the class because, again, they're the dominant group in that classroom. There's more of them in that specific room. And so it's almost the feeling of just because there's more of them and like you were mentioning, that they know each other better and they just have that connection. They feel that their voice is more important. Raising their hand and sharing their ideas is more important than what we have to say about something. Feminism is mocked upon. It's almost looked as though it's flipping a power dynamic. Girls in my school, girls in my community who might, be outspoken about women's issues, girls' issues and experiences, it's often like, what are you talking about? And I don't understand why there's just this like negativity that's associated with being a feminist. So can you tell us a little bit about, Dr. Duffy, your experience with the term feminism?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. And I want to go back to what you just said, because I think you made some really important points as you started to speak about your experiences in the classroom. First, that was a perfect example of an in-group, right? And a dominant culture. And this is this interesting point of action, right, that people have to consider. Do I push against what I know is not feeling right to me? Do I go up to the teacher with a specific example after and say, you allowed that student to speak over that student, or you allow this culture to be built up, a climate technically is what it is, the climate in this classroom to be dominated by that identity? Will you try harder to make space for more voices? More people that aren't going to shout loud to get their points heard? Will you call on the introverts because they're not going to raise their hand and blurt it out, right? So there's that piece. I think that's really important. And it gets to that point around data that is going to help this push against feminism. When you can give specific examples of the reason this is important to us is because this is happening in our classroom. We're not making this up. We are not being able to thrive to our full potential because of bias, unconscious or not, that exists in these environments where we're trying to thrive. So call it what you will, but it's not optimizing human potential. The word feminism specifically seems to have gotten it became a lightning rod back in the 60s and 70s, and it won't go away, right? I don't know if it's the children of the people who went through that original battle and what that stood for. And at its core, it was a non-dominant group trying to raise up. Some of it was activism that people didn't agree with, but at its core, the principle is humans should all be treated equally. And we need to take note of a particular group among us who is not being treated equally. And a good friend of mine likens a situation to the Black Lives Matter movement, right? And she says, people say, all lives matter. And she said, I know, but when one house on the block is on fire, the fire truck doesn't come down and spray water on all the houses. They spray water on the house that needs it. And so back in the day, it was the feminism. It was women. We were trying hard to break through. Now it's other identities, but the fight is the same, and it has political connotations. There are families that pass these values to each other. And so I know that we've spoken before about, could we come up with a new word, right? Could we come up with a humanism word, or a word around, we haven't done it yet, but I think at its core, what we're trying to say is, I see bias. We are all better than that. And you, who are biasing against others consciously or unconsciously, are actually hurting yourself, because again, we're better together and we're better optimized together. So here's another one of those cases where I don't have a great answer for you, but I certainly recognize the challenge.
It seems very challenging, because the privileged groups are not going to want those changes. I mean, we urge them to be more inclusive, and they may not want that because, they've concentrated power and money, and, and they view themselves a certain way as being maybe superior. So it's a challenge. I mean, there's a quote, when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. And so people don't like change. They don't like giving up power. And I don't know how. I'm not sure if you could speak to that a little bit more.
Well, what I can use a women's leadership example actually to perhaps give us hope, right? And I think when it was scarcity, when there was only a certain number of positions of higher leadership that were going to go to women, and now we'd say to more identities. And so this idea of scarcity is, if you get it, I don't get it. Right. And so there's this natural competition. And so there was kind of this not pleasant scenario, evidently, for decades, among women competing to be in kind of leadership positions, mid-level and above. And what we find is that as we embrace more identity and we open up opportunities to more people, of course, that begins to settle down. And it's interesting because it brings up this is not related, but I'm just going to grab it because it brings up another concept, which is called role congruity theory, right? And so when you're a leader at the top, you behave a certain way because you have to be congruent with that role. And right now, we still have a pretty masculine top dog leadership paradigm. And so women who do aspire and lead up into these higher levels of leadership tend to have to embody those identities, that role congruity, to be effective, but they're penalized for it, right? By people who say, oh, she forgets who she is, and she's not being a nice boss to me anymore. And it's because the boss needs to do certain things that aren't necessarily like your girlfriend. And, I have a good friend, Dr. Ann Litwin, who's done research on women at work. And so we have to really think about that. And I think we have to be ready as times change. If we understand our own privilege and our unearned power because of that privilege, whether it's the color of our skin, our gender, other identities that we carry that are dominant and privileged, we have to be ready to give up something. We have to make more room at the table. If we make more room at the table, we're going to create a bigger table. And this is that it's not a zero-sum game. And we also find, particularly around gendered areas, that there's this assumption, well, if she gets the job, then I don't get the job. And that's not actually true, right? It isn't a either or, it's a we. There are more jobs. There's more room at the table. There's a bigger table. And me getting more does not give you less. We're just all getting more. And as we go into that kind of stage, at least in a Western culture and in the United States, as we move into that reality, I think people will gradually realize they're not giving up as much as they think. They're just sharing and growing the pie.
That is beautiful.
It's optimistic. Hopefully we're getting there. It feels to me like we are. And as I watch women aspire to moving into positions of leadership and to taking risks and to believing in themselves and to understanding the context that they find themselves in, more and more, we're finding that we are redefining the definition of leadership, of entrepreneurial activity, of doing good in the world, right? In a much broader way. And we're all benefiting.
That's an amazing, amazing point that you bring up. And something I was just thinking about is I know that, as women and as girls, we can really change. You gave such great examples of how we can recognize our own bias and how we can empower ourselves and one another. But again, we can't control others' behaviors. And I think that point that you also made was really important earlier. And so a question I have is, many girls and women are going to experience sexism in the school place or in the workplace. And they might not know where that line is to speak out or do something about it. And what do you suggest women or girls should do to actively oppose these microaggressions that may not seem like you need to say something about it? But I think that you should.
Well, I think the first thing we have to do is we have to make a decision based on the context, if this is important to me, right? Is this important enough for me to take on? And that's always everybody's decision to make. It's a personal decision. And it's never the responsibility of the person who's being violated to educate others. But you may choose to. Right? You may choose to go in and disarm that person. So decision is first. And there are some researchers that did a Harvard Business Review article, Washington, Birch, and Roberts. And they said, first you discern, you decide if you're going to do something, then you disarm, right? Are you going to help that person maybe see and make them more aware of how what they did landed on you and its impact? Regardless of intent, and that's an important distinguishing characteristic. Intent and impact are two different things. And some people say often their first response is, I didn't mean it. And it's like, I understand that you didn't mean it, but let me share with you how it landed on me and its impact on me. And that's only if you choose to disarm. They say you can defy, you can kind of get in somebody's face and say, well, you're wrong about that. Let me tell you. This is my experience of that, and here's some examples that will defy your assumption. And always at its core is that it's this personal decision, right, that you can take it on. So I think this is an interesting needle that we thread on a daily basis. We have to decide what's at stake and whether we're willing to do it. What I would suggest is that you experiment with behaviors of taking something on that you may have let go. And you might do that with a friend nearby. You might do that in a setting where you definitely should do it in a setting where you feel safe. You may find that you need to get an ally in a teacher or somebody who you trust that isn't a friend, but somebody with authority behind them. And just experiment with what would happen if I did take this person on, assuming the most positive outcome, assuming good intent, like that they didn't mean it, that they will respond to edification, that they might even have an opportunity to change their behavior and not do this to someone else, and just go for it. But again, always a personal decision. And the other thing is this gets back to that, is it me? Like that, oh, is it me? It's not you. It is not you. If you are insulted, if you have been aggressed, no, it happened and it's probably worth addressing. It's just your decision to do it. We often, we do that a lot. Like, oh, he probably didn't mean that, or, oh, I'll let that one go. And that's the death by 1,000 cuts that they say about microaggression, right? That they build up, and then somebody says something and you blow up at them and they're like, whoa, I didn't mean it. I'm really sorry. But this is another new kind of era right now as we're all learning about this and learning kind of how to navigate that, never gone there before space. But we have to go there when we're ready and when we're willing to experiment and perhaps risk And that's the other thing. Know what you have to risk, you know?
What is the role of finding your community, finding your tribe in sort of, in strengthening yourself, in fighting off microaggressions?
Well, we like to frame this in the social science concept of self-efficacy, right? Finding your tribe. And the way I think about it is these groups of people, these tribes, are different than a network. So a lot of people hear the word network, right? You have to network. You have to build people around you. And I feel like networks are transactional. You're building a certain web of people around you because you kind of need things from them. You give things to them. It's transactional. Tribes are transformational. These are the people who get you. And they are there by your side and they understand you. And the reason that they're so connected to self-efficacy is that they give you an environment for the four main pillars of this concept. One is they give you a place to practice what we call mastery experiences. You can try things out with your tribe. Like, let's say you were microaggressed. You could go to your people and say, this just happened to me. This is how I want to respond. Can you give me some feedback, right? So you practice. Mastery experiences are, you try something in a safe space, you're much more likely to be able to go do it in other scenarios. The second is what tribes give us, or this group of people around us, is role modeling, right? It's called vicarious learning through others. We see people that kind of look and sound like us doing something, and all of a sudden we're like, well, she can do it, I can do it. The third way is it keeps our anxiety down, because when we watch other people do it or we hear of their experiences among this group of people that we surrounded ourselves with, we realize we're not alone. We realize we're not the person that just didn't get the memo, right? Oh, everybody else knows what's going on here and I don't. We all of a sudden we're like, oh, she didn't know what she was doing either. And look, she lived to talk about it. Or, oh, she even, like, it didn't go well. And she's still okay. Like, she experimented, it didn't go well. Wow, okay, that's really interesting. So it helps us calm down. And then the fourth way that this group of people, or this tribe of people we put around us, is through champions, right? Championing others, that you got this, go for it, you're great. We need that. We need cheerleaders. So self-efficacy is built through this group of people, our closest board of advisors, through mastery experiences, vicarious learning through role models, helping to keep our anxiety low and championing us to be at our very best. And that gives us the sense in our gut that we can do whatever's in front of us. We can take on a microaggression. We can go for a leadership role in school. We can try for that summer job or internship that we might have held back on before, because we know in our gut, not just like intellectually or people tell us, we know we have what it takes. And building that is important, and surrounding ourselves with people that help us build it is probably one of the most important things you can do to be an effective woman entrepreneurial leader.
I'm struggling with what to say, because this has just been so inspiring. And, I just think you're so kind, you're very humane, and you're incredibly wise. I mean, I really could keep listening to you.
Well, thank you. I do want to share one thing, and I've learned this at Babson. And if you'll just indulge me, I think it's a way to think about being entrepreneurial, because we started with, how do we think about women leaders? And then we talked about being entrepreneurial and understanding our context and bias and all the things that might, create interesting challenges and opportunities. But I'd like to share just a quick methodology that I live my life by now. And it's a methodology of experimentation. So it's called entrepreneurial thought and action, and it's very simple. The first premise is some of us think, again, this is gendered, we have to have it all figured out. We have to know exactly where we're going. We have to know what that game plan is. We just have to have a general sense of, I'd like to kind of do that. I'd like to make a difference this way, or I'd like to be that kind of a person. And when you think of it broadly, we call it the future desired state. And one idea emerges. Let me try something. And then when you think, the next step is to think about, what are the means at hand? We too often think about, what do I need to make this happen? Not what do I have already to make this happen. So the first thing is, what do I already have that I could start to move on that idea? And you think about, who am I? Like me, what do I know? Who do I know? What resources are readily available? Then you think about, what am I willing to risk here, right? So I have an idea. I know who I am, who I know, what I know. And now I think about, what am I willing to risk? Little time, little dignity, little sleep, awkwardness. If you want to raise a microaggression or a culture in a classroom, maybe some backlash, like, what am I willing to risk? And then you have a sense of, I'm willing to risk that. And then who might I enroll, we call it? One or two people that kind of I talk to about this idea. They'll help shape it a little. They'll help give you some, add a girl, add a boy, add a whatever your identity is. And then you move. And this is the most important thing. It's a tiny little movement. It might be one conversation. It might be you're going to go research something on the internet. It might be one step. And the reason that we break it down to one step is because you learn so much in real time from taking that one step, instead of thinking about it, instead of thinking of all the reasons you can't do it, instead of thinking what you need to make it happen. You just move, and you get real-time data about what that one step did. And then you feed that data back into the process, and you just kind of one step your way forward. So what happens is, when something fails, it fails in a very controlled way, because you knew what you were willing to risk. And it's a smart, fast failure. But if it doesn't fail, it might be half right. So you course correct. You wouldn't have had that information if you didn't at least step and try it. And if it's right, you begin the next step and you start the process over again, right? So it's this idea of any idea, any future state, don't have to have it figured out. The means at hand, what are you willing to risk? Some people to enroll, and then act. And if you act in that way, little by little, you will get wherever you want to go.
That is seriously such amazing advice. And I think, as a lot of people are afraid of that idea of failure. And when you said like smart, fast failure, I've never heard that phrase before. And I think it's so smart to say that, because people are so afraid of, they have to plan everything out and know exactly what's happening so ahead of time. But plan one step at a time and act. That's just amazing.
Right.
Yep.
And we're not socialized for failure. I always used to say, why don't we have a Girl Scout badge for failure? And, why aren't we teaching people to fail as part of success? Because iteration and experimentation, anybody who's a scientist knows that, the failures are part of the success. It's part of the journey. But we don't get socialized that way. From the first time we bring a red X home on a paper as a first grader or something, we're like, life is over for me. But we have to get used to it. And that's another reason to do it, so that you get used to these little, small, fast failures. And you realize, okay, they're just part of the journey. And you build up resilience to that over time.
You seem incredible in helping people optimize their potential. I'm awed.
I think it's a journey we're all on, and I'm delighted that we had a chance to speak about it together. It's really been fun, and I think these are universal principles that we can all, I know I live by them. I'm on this entrepreneurial journey every day.
I mean, you mentioned the word transformational, and that's what I feel that this episode is going to be for a lot of people. You are absolutely, absolutely amazing, and you offered such actionable advice for women and girls and anybody who wants to optimize their experience, even as a leader or someone who wants to recognize their own biases and improve how they treat others as well. So what an amazing conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And we could go on all day, couldn't we? I mean, it's just,
as I said,
it's
I could
interesting
keep
stuff.
listening. I really could.
Absolutely.
We all have a lot of work to do and a lot of opportunities ahead.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, both. It's been an honor and a privilege.
Thank you, Sachi.
Thank you, Sachi. Thank you, Dr. Chandra.
Thank you.